That was in Khartoum last week. The declaration, we have 5 points there. We see ceasefire is one of them, but we've had these ceasefires for quite a long time. We wonder if this will be the discernible difference. And of course, also they're given 72 hours, to make sure that this ceasefire is effective. We want to hear from, of course, the man himself from South Sudan, who is better placed to tell us what is happening with the Khartoum Declaration. We've just highlighted some of them: a permanent ceasefire, reforms in the security sector, also rehabilitation of the oil wells, the improvement of South Sudan infrastructure connected with the livelihoods of citizens, the regional countries invited to deploy necessary forces to supervise the ceasefire, and the challenge is achieving a permanent ceasefire within 72 hours. 72 hours have elapsed, have they?
Well, they elapsed, and of course the ceasefire was violated, as we all predicted.
It has been violated.
And even as we speak, there's been confrontation that is going on in different parts of Upper Nile. Mm-hmm. You see, as you correctly put the ball, this is, I don't know, I even stopped counting of how many ceasefire that we have signed. It becomes the thing that you do. You just go, you say, okay, let's sign, but it doesn't mean anything. So this is, in essence, what is going on. But the thing about, if you read this Khartoum agreement closely, there are some things there that make you wonder, what the hell is going on in Khartoum? Article 5 in particular.
Yes.
Article 5, if you break it down, is very misplaced. It starts with a sentence that the security of the oil field is a responsibility of citizens of South Sudan. Okay, security of oil field is a responsibility of all citizens of South Sudan. Now, what is that supposed to mean? This is a national security asset. It's a strategic national security asset. Security, it belongs to all the citizens. That makes no sense. It's something that the responsibility of securing oil field belong to the government of South Sudan. And then when you read further down, you go down, it says that South Sudan, in discharge of its security details, if needed, may call upon the government of Sudan to help it secure the oil fields. Let me remind you who we were fighting for all these half a century. It was the government of Sudan.
Yes.
The government of Sudan, epitomized by President Omar al-Bashir and his Islamist elite that basically wanted to impose Islamic ideology on South Sudan. And as we speak,
yes,
the borders between South Sudan and Sudan has not been demarcated. And this is because these borders are rich in minerals. And what Omar al-Bashir want to do is basically to carve out parts of South Sudan, places like Mile 14, places like Hijlik, Panto, and Abyei. Abyei is an area that has been even declared by the International Court of Arbitration belonging to South Sudan. They held a referendum in which they overwhelmingly voted to join South Sudan. Up to now, nothing has happened there. And as we speak, the border between South Sudan and Sudan is closed. Closed by who? By Omar al-Bashir, so that it can strangle South Sudan economically. So now, all of a sudden, you have a Bashir call our leaders to Khartoum, and he says, let's sign a peace deal. And by the way, I'll invite my military to come back to protect you. It completely makes no sense. And in fact, if you read of the initial draft that they proposed, they had things like South Sudan will be divided and it will have 3 capital cities.
Yes.
One will be in Malakal, one in Wau, one in Juba, 3 vice presidents sitting in different places, which is what Khartoum actually tried to do in the early 1980s. And which is one of the things that led to the war going on in South Sudan. And all of a sudden, we are hearing from sources that Bashir is even telling some of our leaders in Khartoum that he has promised to reunite the country before he dies. And you hear some of the leaders of South Sudan, like Lama Kol. I sent you that article that was published in Khartoum in Arabic. Lama Kol is saying in Khartoum, we cannot rule out confederacy between Sudan and South Sudan. So what is going on in South Sudan, as I was talking before, you have elites that have essentially forgotten what they were fighting for.
Yes.
They have been in a business of betraying everything our people have been fighting for the last 13 years. When we were fighting to create a new Sudan, because we people of South Sudan were marginalized in our country. We were not given opportunities. There was no development taking place in our area. No roads were built, no school, nothing whatsoever. So we complained the reason why this was the case was because others, northerners, were the one running the government, and as a result they were allocating resources to their own areas while marginalizing ours. That is why we took up arms, so that we fight, so that our own sons and daughters get in there and are able to then allocate resources for our own development. In 2005 we achieved that. What happened? We got a lot of money, both international money, our own money. What has our government done with these billions? We are talking about billions, over $28 billion that have come to South Sudan since 2005. Not a single road has been built. Nothing whatsoever. Most of our education and health is funded entirely by donors. And then the military that we used to actually fight the war, the SPLA, what has happened to it? Since 2005, SPLA was opened up to militias. So anybody that had a militia, a tribal militia, you just join SPLA, you are given ranks. So our military, which we built for over 2 decades and used it as instrument to fight against Khartoum, all of a sudden this military was diluted and the capacity was removed. It was turned into a tribal military. The same thing with the SPLM, the party that championed the ideology of liberation, that promised the vision of New Sudan, that promised to use our oil to basically build roads, build infrastructure, to build wealth for the future generation. This party was destroyed. So as I sit here, and as many South Sudanese that are sitting at home and everywhere they are sitting in the world, we are wondering, do these leaders understand why we paid the awesome price of 2.5 million people to create this country? And Dibal is so heartbreaking to watch what is going on to Khartoum. Just before our independence, Omar al-Bashir said publicly that these people of South Sudan, they cannot govern themselves. Salva Kiir was there, he heard it. Riek Machar was there and he heard it. And these people have now allowed that statement of Bashir to come into reality. And now they go to Khartoum to go and talk to al-Bashir, to make Bashir to be this guy that brings peace to South Sudan, when he's the architect of all the problem we are facing in South Sudan. It makes me, and I'm very sure many people in my generations are so upset. We feel betrayed by our leaders. Not only have they betrayed the sacrifices of the past generation, but they are also betraying the aspirations of the future generation. And this is why people of South Sudan, they must understand that these leaders, they are not what they claim to be. They no longer have any fidelity. They don't even know what it means to be nationalistic. They don't understand the meaning of sacrifice, to give yourself for a greater good. It seemed they were fighting so that they can become rich, so that they can get access to positions and become people that are known somewhere in the world. This is what they were fighting for, and this is not what we were fighting for. We were fighting so that we can have better lives. We were fighting so that our children can have better lives, and we have the resources to do it. What is needed now for us is to get back to our roots, and that is the root of self-sacrifice. People of South Sudan must understand that their hard-won independence is being jeopardized before their eyes, and they can no longer continue to stay aloof, that this is a small crisis that we'll overcome. We cannot overcome this crisis if we continue to have these leaders. What is needed now is for the people of South Sudan to come together, reclaim their country back from these opportunists that have hijacked our independence.
All right, and of course we have all that breaking news as well, that we had information earlier, and now we have it for you. That is that 9 people have died so far and 20 others injured after a bus went up in flames during a head-on collision with a truck in Emali. That is what we have this morning. Information trickling into our studios today. 9 people have died, 20 others, 20 injured, I should say, after a bus went up in flames during a head-on collision with a truck in Emali. We shall be giving you also details of this much later in the course of the program. That is the information. 9 people have died, 20 others injured after a bus went up in flames during a head-on collision with a truck in Emali. That is the scanty information that we do have. But as soon as information trickles into the studio, we shall relay that to you. But that is the latest so far, and we eagerly wait for more information to also come into hand and then we shall relay that to you. But we continue with the conversation apace about what is happening in South Sudan. Let's hear from Lucy Mukuria, then we'll also get a clarification of what you had to say also on the East African. You really are not happy, and evidently we can see that today. But let's hear from Lucy Mukuria, then we'll continue.
I'm sorry about everything you're going through. You know, you talk and, you know, I hear your heart. I hear everything that you're going through, you know, like, why aren't we outraged enough? From that tweet that was projected earlier, somebody said, how can the colonialists withstand some of the conditions we have to? But why aren't we outraged, us? Why do we want somebody else to be outraged? Why aren't we outraged? Personally, I am outraged. But my outrage does not serve the people who are suffering. The way I think about this issue, it is agreement after agreement, you know, and on the surface, you talk about everything that is happening as if it is a cause, but for me, I actually see it as a symptom. You know, when people come to me and they say, I'm having a problem, I say, what's the problem? Oh gosh, I'm having difficulty sleeping at night. I find myself having a quick temper. I don't start addressing the insomnia. I don't start addressing the quickness to temper. I ask the question, what happened to you? What has been going on? I go deeper. So when I think about the leadership of South Sudan, you know, yes, it should fall squarely on them, because they are the people who have been entrusted by the majority to basically, you know, take them to the next frontier in a peaceful way that will make them productive. But they are not doing this. And for me, I feel like it's time to begin to explore the possibility that they actually don't have the internal resources to do that. They don't have the intellectual capacity to do that. They don't have the compassion to do that. They don't have the will to do that. But also, when I look at the history of the leaders of South Sudan, what sets them aside from the normal Sudanese person who is also struggling to survive? Outwardly, we say, become our leader because you belong to the majority tribe. Become our leader because you belong to the opposing tribe. And those are the qualifications. But what about the intellectualism that comes with that? What about that ability to have those personal characteristics that are more about the community needs as opposed to personal needs? I listen to you, Peter, and I'm reminded of couples who come in for therapy. The first few sessions when they come in, all there is noise. This one has done that, this one does this one upsets me, this one. But then when you separate them and you begin to engage the people individually, and you say to this person, what was your idea of marriage when you got into it? Mm-hmm. Where did your idea of the kind of husband or wife you're supposed to be, where did those ideas come from? And you go deeper into the person to begin to understand how it is they see themselves relating to this person. And it's not unusual to find that people will try to hold the other person accountable for their own happiness. Mm-hmm. You know, and that is the biggest mistake. That, you know, the individual couples don't see themselves as bringing something of themselves to contribute to the harmonious relationship. They are like, you are responsible for my happiness. So when we come to the two leaders of South Sudan, I feel like I want to ask them. Because, you know, look at Salva Kiir. He basically grew up as a child soldier. What has that done to him? Look at Machar. Yeah. You know, he's educated, very well educated, but he still is not taken seriously because of a difference that has been magnified because of just a historical context. So I think there's a lot of heart that cannot help them to actually see beyond their personal grievances to be able to be of service. So I don't think they have the internal capacity to actually lead people anywhere.
Right. Let's hear from Kisiangani.
Yeah, I think Peter talked passionately and took a bit of time so I understand. And the thematic areas he raised was one, about the role of Sudan, and two, about the problem that underpins South Sudan and trying to suggest a solution. So on the issue of the role of Sudan, you remember there was a previous agreement in Addis, and there actually claims when these fellows were called in for a face-to-face discussion, apparently there had been a pre-developed agreement which they were just supposed to sign. And the accusations that South Sudan had a lot of input into that agreement. Among the provisions, it was that Sudan had to actually take charge of the oil fields, this idea of the three capital cities. And the argument is that, you know, Sudan understands the politics, the dynamics in South Sudan very well, so trying to exploit this for its own political and economic interests. You know, Sudan itself currently is facing economic challenges, and it has been benefiting from the transit fees when oil goes through Port Khartoum. So it wants the oil to flow so it can benefit in that way. But also exploiting, some argue that to have South Sudan in the state it is, because then it becomes easier to manipulate it.
Yes.
So there are those arguments out there, but apparently both sides are resisting some of these provisions in the agreement.
Yes.
That is why it eventually ended up with some certain changes which I cannot go into details, which you mentioned. Yeah, in terms of solution, I think you had Erastus Mwenje, and he's also talked about it here a few weeks ago. And for me, I've done a bit of research on South Sudan. You have the Troika, the US, Norway, and Britain, and you have IGAD, and they seem keen to have an agreement for the sake of having an agreement. So it is put there in the limelight, and the celebrations at least to have an agreement. But so many of them have never held any ground. So for me, you have a fundamental problem here. And the problem is, to an extent, again, internal, where you have two leaders. If I give you an experience when I was there a few years ago, when Riek Machar was still the vice president,
yes,
office was on one side, the president was on one side. And I was told every time the vice president had to cross to the president's office, his bodyguards had to be disarmed. It tells you this suspicion that has existed for a very long time, but there are also fundamental issues around governance, which we can go into details. So the problem for me with South Sudan is systemic. You have weapons all over the country, but you also don't have institutions that are supposed to function the way they are supposed. The president has a lot of powers. So you have this scenario, and people exploiting the situation for their own interests. So in terms of the problem, I support what Erastus Mwenje suggested a few years ago. From my understanding, South Sudan needs reforms. And there's no way the two actors can actually reform South Sudan. For the president to reform South Sudan, it means negotiating himself out of power. And there are people who are actually around him who benefit from the current status. If you have another actor coming into government, they lose the leverage. So you have this situation. The other actor is also not blameless. They have their own interests, which we can discuss in detail. But the point here is that given the history of suspicion, where you have, he can tell us about Riek Machar, the history, where he's seen as a troublemaker. So you have all these dynamics. And often, other than the two, the conflicts right now has, for the lack of a better word, changed. You have different actors, groups that have come up and they're fighting each other. So it's not only about the supporters of the two groups. So you have this situation. And for me, what you need is reforms in South Sudan. And my proposal, which is likely to be resisted by the government, because they argue that they were elected in office, is that you need a neutral person for an interim period who can actually agree not to contest in the next election, then have that process where they can sit together and talk about reforming South Sudan, put in place institutions and the relevant mechanisms, then you can have elections. But that was the way we are going with the regional actors, just trying to push for an agreement for the sake of having an agreement so that we can be seen to have made progress. I think we're not moving. We're going to see the same problems arising. We can speak also about the limitations of the regional institution. You have regional interests. All countries around South Sudan have the interest. You have also internationally have interests. I was in South Sudan, and instructively, you literally find these technical advisors. Every office you'll find a technical advisor from this country, from that other country, from another country. So they have their own interests because of the resources that South Sudan has. So you have certain challenges where you have a top-down approach to have a resolution, which to me will not work.
Right, let's see, Dr. Kananji.
Agreements, generally, they are just mere words and writings on paper if they, in the absence of a credible enforcement third party. And I think that explains why some of these agreements are unraveling very first.
Yes.
Now, this week also one thing that has emerged from Juba is the government was sponsoring a motion to extend the life of the current president. And since it enjoys a majority in parliament, it appears as if that is going to pass. Now, while, of course, we cannot have a vacuum in Juba, something like that I think is something that should be negotiated, because if it passes, I think it's going to militate against the spirit of the very agreement that had just been reached. Number two, in any agreement, it has to be very clearly defined. Ambiguity in agreements, especially in international agreements, is always a recipe for failure, because then different parties are going to interpret differently, and therefore they're going to undertake different measures in relation to it. I think my brother here was very kind to talk about our South Sudanese leaders. I don't really see a lot of leaders there. What I see is predatory tribal chiefs who are actually seeking profit at the expense of their own people.
Right. Let's hear from Professor Obadiah.
Dubal, Peter talked with passion, and on which you can hear it, you can feel it. Emmanuel enumerated a number of issues that are really, if you are a student of international relations, you can understand. No country will serve another country without their own national interest. That is given. The issue here is we are warlords. I happened to travel very extensively in South Sudan in 2013 because my university had deployed people all over Southern Sudan to create capacity development. And eventually, I, together with the governor of Unity State, signed an agreement to create a college at Unity State. That college was built by Chinese. Everything completed, all set. I deployed the staff. We were ready to start. Some people want masters, want PhD. I said, no. Let's focus on capacity development. Let's focus on the grassroots. Because South Sudan, like unfortunately, like most African countries, all our intellectuals are outside the continent. They're in America, they're in Australia, they're in Europe, they're everywhere. And it is important to develop this synergy, this culture, this value of the people of South Sudan. What did you fight for? Before you talk about all these other things. And so unfortunately, Dubal, it's going to come down to the people of Southern Sudan to solve the Southern Sudan problem. We can all talk about it. We can talk about EGAD, we can talk about UN, we can talk about AU, we can talk about all these other things. But it's going to come down to the people at the grassroots level to solve and wake up and say, this is our country. So, Omar al-Bashir is a colonial master who's looking at continue to exploit as much as he can, everything that he can out of Southern Sudan for his own goods.
Right.
Okay, and so the issue and the bigger question is South Sudan going to become like DRG Congo?
Right, that's a probing question. And of course, we have this particular also quote really tucked away in the East African, just to take a bit of it, which is up there. And this is from you, Peter Biarajak. You say, it is an insult to believe that President al-Bashir will protect our oil fields. There's no way we can reunite with a country we try to get off our backs for 50 years to protect our oil, our fields. This is what you said, Peter Biara-Jack. But we have John Penn, who also goes full steam ahead to say this. He represents South Sudanese civil society in IGAD high-level revitalization program. And he says here that he's accusing actually President al-Bashir for trying to reintroduce the 3 original regions of Equatoria, Upper Nile, and Bahr el Ghazal that were created by Khartoum and Jaffa Numeiri. And this is what actually Professor Naomi Damba is alluding to. There is no way that, yes, you can take us, it's like taking now what, a wolf back to the hens and telling them this is how we're going to distribute, you know, and we'll take care of your pens. That is not really bound to happen. Maybe you can just comment on this briefly. The flash interest that al-Bashir really has on South Sudan, it is not really severed. You know, from Sudan and South Sudan, there's still a flash of interest as far as all whales are concerned.
Absolutely. You see, Dibal, for the last few years, Sudan has been getting a greater share of our oil than us. Because in 2012, we signed this cooperation agreement with Sudan that said that we will pay Sudan a lot of money for allowing South Sudan to secede. Essentially, we were to transfer $3.2 billion to Sudan. So this was reduced, it was calculated into how much money would be charged per barrel, and it came down to $26 per barrel. And this is how much we've been giving Sudan. And you remember very well the oil prices dropped, and at some point they were even under $40. So if you are giving $26 per barrel to al-Bashir, and then you have to pay the cost to the oil companies, they have to recoup some of their profits, you are left with nothing. This is what al-Bashir has been getting. And as he mentioned before, al-Bashir now is facing serious economic crisis in Sudan. Sudan now, along with Venezuela, have some of the highest inflation rates in the world. Just from like last month, the price of meat doubled in Khartoum. So Bashir is being pushed by his own interests, and he sees this country that is being run by clueless people. And by the way, I have to also mention in 2014, 2015, Salva Kiir, our president, flew to Khartoum, and guess what he did in Khartoum? He went and basically delivered something that amounted to an apology for South Sudan becoming an independent country. This is somebody that pride himself for fighting for independence of South Sudan. He looks at himself as somebody that has sacrificed a lot, but when I look at him, I see someone who has no idea what he was fighting for, because everything you have seen since he has taken power in 2005, for 13 years, everything that you have seen, whether it come down to the management of economy, building of institution, reconciling and uniting people, helping them heal from the trauma, and charting a vision of state for our people, he has done none of this. So for him to go back to Khartoum is basically, he's basically showing insecurity, basically showing what al-Bashir was saying was correct, that these people called South Sudanese cannot govern themselves. That is the legacy of Salva Kiir. This is what Salva Kiir will take to the bank. So what I'm saying here is, Dubar, al-Bashir wants that oil. This is why he's refusing to demarcate the border. This is why he's holding BA hostage. And he has stooges. People around Salva Kiir, all of them, were people that work closely with al-Bashir. In fact, South Sudan is a country that is most infiltrated by foreigners. You have al-Bashir security architecture heavily infiltrating our country. The spy chief of Sudan, Salah Ghosh, was living in Juba for 2 years, being maintained by our government and being given our passports to travel with it. This is a guy who was the right-hand man of Bashir. So what Bashir is saying now is you want to unite the country. And our leaders, because they have failed so much, they have abandoned our allies like the US, UK, all the countries that stood with us. They have been abandoned. And Bashir has been very clever in using immigration, terrorism, as a way of courting the West. And now he's actually a good guy with the West. US has now removed sanctions from Sudan. And you see sanctions being put on us. It shows you this massive failure. So I agree with them. Salva Kiir and Riek Machar cannot possibly end the crisis in South Sudan. And they do not have a vision for South Sudan, because if they did, we would have seen it. So what is needed, and I agree with Professor. Professor, you're absolutely right. What is needed is for us, the people of South Sudan, to do this thing over again. We need to mobilize ourselves. We need to organize ourselves around an agenda in which we can build the kind of future we fought for.
Right. Isn't it amazing and really consternating that we have the new Prime Minister Abiy, of course, from Ethiopia, who really orchestrated this particular, meeting in Khartoum? Al-Bashir is a wanted man by the ICC. And how can a man who actually he's committed crime against humanity also give a spawning ground for where peace deal can be made? It really flies in the face of what really we think. So how can it hang together? You wanted a man, a crimes against humanity. Here you're trying to broker peace in South. Was this also maybe a miscalculated call from Prime Minister Abiy?
It was a joke.
It was a joke.
It was a joke, Dubai, because even in Sudan, they had a massive civil war going on. There's a war in Darfur. Everybody knows about the war in Darfur. There's a war in Blue Nile. There is a war in southern Kordofan. And Bashir has not solved these things. So how is he to come and tell us, oh, leaders of South Sudan, you must rise above your private interests and make peace for your people, show leadership? He is not showing leadership. This is a guy that is looking for his own interests. And because our leaders are so corrupt, our leaders are probably the most corrupt people in the world. They're the most corrupt, they're morally bankrupt, they have no idea of what they were fighting for, they're so addicted to power. This is why they go to Khartoum. Otherwise, what that IGAD communique said, it was that the next meeting will take place in Khartoum, and then after that meeting, al-Bashir was to hand over the file to Uhuru Kenyatta, and all the minutes of the discussion in Khartoum were to be handed over to Uhuru Kenyatta. And the leaders of South Sudan were supposed to come here to Kenya for the final negotiation. But now they're still in Khartoum. Why are they in Khartoum? Why are they in Khartoum when al-Bashir is proposing to bring his troops to come and protect our oil fields, when he's holding hostage known territories of South Sudan? And Kenya here was the place where the CPA of 2005 was signed. It was signed here at Nyayo Stadium. It was brokered by General Sambweyo with a strong support. President Moi, President Kibaki, all the Kenyan leadership supported this. They understand the issues of South Sudan. They've been standing with us in solidarity. Why are we in Khartoum when we are supposed to be in Kenya?
Thank you. All right. Maybe we can get our closing comments. Let's hear from Dr. Emmanuel Kisengani. Your closing remarks, 30 seconds, sir.
Yeah, I think for me, largely, I will speak about responses to most of the problems that we have on the continent, especially in relation to conflict. We have a body called the African Union, and it has very good provisions about responding to most of the problems, conflicts that we have on the continent. They also have a subsidiarity principle where you have a conflict within a certain region, then it's given to the regional economic body within that region. But I think all these institutions are wanting. They have tools, they have very good frameworks about how to resolve our problems. I think there's a big challenge when it comes to implementation. I think most of our institutions are too dependent, even in terms of funding, on foreign actors, and we can therefore not implement our own agendas. So there's a problem there.
Right, thank you. Let's hear from Dr. Hassan Khanenje.
Sovereignty comes with responsibility, and that is something that sometimes we miss a lot. Now, the paradox of a lot of our African leaders, some of our regional leaders, is we don't see contradiction in our actions.
Yes.
And to have a vision, Doc, you need to have eyes. A lot of these leaders do not have eyes as we're speaking, not literally, but figuratively. And for us to be able to move ahead, especially when it comes to conflict and peace and economics, we actually have to recognize the contradiction that go on. Now, what is happening even in Khartoum right now, how come is being accepted, well over? It's as if there's no contradiction in what is going on, but there is. And so unless we recognize and acknowledge some of our own failures, actually, we may not be likely to move ahead. Now, the recent efforts by Abiy, while it might sound as being ill-informed, partly we need to laud him for the efforts he's trying to make to bring about peace in this region. And I hope every leader can at least chip in and make their own personal effort towards that end.
Thank you. Dr. Biarajak, 30 seconds.
People of South Sudan must realize that these leaders we call them leaders. I think you have a better word for it.
Yeah, predatory tribal chiefs.
Predatory tribal chiefs. These guys are not going to bring any peace whatsoever to our people, to our children, to anything that we value. These are people that are addicted to power for themselves. What we need to do as people of South Sudan is to realize this and accept for peace to be in our country, it would require us to do the hard work. We need to get back to South Sudan. We need to travel to the states, to the counties, talk to our people, let them know that the leaders that we have supported for so long are now betraying our hard-won independence. And this is unacceptable.
Right, thank you. Lucy Mukuria, briefly, 30 seconds.
Wow. I have compassion for the two leaders. I have compassion for them because they lack the ability to, you know, they did something great by bringing the country up to where they brought it. But they've not been able to do the internal work that can be able to progress the agenda of the country as a whole further. Yes. And the idea of the African strongman is very, very strong in this game. And so I have compassion for them. But at the end of the day, world peace, regional peace, national peace, community peace begins with inner peace, which is lacking down there. So we want the people of South Sudan to, you know, make a difference. But, you know, no pressure will come from the people who are suffering at all.
Right. Professor Naomi Damba.
There is a saying in Nigeria that there is no, if there is no chaos, it is not Africa. The government must be of the people, by the people, and for the people, period.
Thank you very much.